Please welcome Peter Greenaway.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. In some curious way, the subject of these lectures is absolutely ideal for me. I have been accused of being anally retentive because I am so concerned about structure, so concerned about the form of the media as well as its content. It's been a constant complaint that Greenaway spends far too much time on the structure and not enough on the content. But I'm sure all of you know, French philosophy recently has said, there is no such thing as content anymore. Everything is form, everything is structure. And in a sense, paraphrasing that famous phrase, the medium is the message, in fact, the structure has become the content. We can argue that for a long time to come and maybe not get a very satisfactory answer. But it is certainly true, and I suppose this is generally a characteristic, shall we say, of the avant-garde, and also a characteristic maybe of alternative forms against the orthodoxies, that inevitably there is a concern and an interest and a prioritizing of notions of form or structure within what we shall say is the unorthodox cinema. And it's been a characteristic, certainly since the cinema was invented in 1895. I would make absolutely no apology whatsoever for this particular phenomenology, whether you take its good side or its bad side. I believe cinema in general is far too sentimental, far too emotionally organized, far too much far away from so many of the characteristics of from where it arose, which primarily for me should always be painting. I am, of course, incredibly biased in all these things because I was trained as a painter, and I certainly think that painting is the absolute supreme of all the arts. Now, that might antagonize all the text masters and mistresses in the audience, but it says in the Old Testament, doesn't it? In the beginning was the word, wrong, wrong, wrong. In the beginning was the image. And there's almost every reason to suppose you cannot have text without first having image. So I'm sorry, the gentlemen who wrote the Old Testament are wrong. Depending on your politics, sir. I am, I suppose, deeply disenchanted by the whole notion of cinema. In fact, I don't think, let me be really provocative at the very start, since I hope to continue my provocations. I don't think anybody in the cinema has really ever seen any cinema. If you believe that the cinema was invented in 1895, you have all seen 119 years of illustrated text. Every single film you've ever seen, I bet you, started life with a text. Even if that text was a scribble on the back. I used to say on the back of a cigarette packet, but nobody smokes anymore, so I have to say on the back, as we say, of an envelope. We have a text-based cinema. I suppose it's very easy for me to say this, that let's think maybe the most biggest event, I suppose, in Orthodox cinema in the last 15 years is Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings. And you know, and I know, that these aren't films. These are pieces of illustrated text. You can go down to the marketplace very easily and buy those books. But the same could be said for Almodovar, and Lars von Trier, and Godard, and Eisenstein. Every film, and this always seems to me to be a great tragedy, you've ever seen since 1895. Some people say there are films before 1895. Some people say that cinema was invented in China in 300 BC. But we could talk about that on another occasion, maybe. I think this is a tragedy because, as you know, we have a text-based culture all over the world. You know how it goes. You all go to school, happily scrabbling with your pens and easels and oil paint, till you're about 9, 10, 11, and the teacher says, put all that away, get serious. We now have to consider text. So that means round about the age, I suppose, indeed, of 10, 11, 12, people indeed do follow the instructions of the teacher and put away the crayons and the paints, and basically they never pick them up ever again. I was in an airplane a couple of days ago, and I read in an in-flight movie that children born in the last 18 months have a life expectancy of 120. I don't know what the life expectancy of an adult, let's say an adult female, because female tend to last longer than males. I suppose what would it be? Would it be about 84 in this country now? Life expectancy of a female in 2014 in Finland is 84. So if you put away your paints and your crayons age 10, that means at least 70 years of barrenness. 70 years where you never really seriously try to portray your imagery ever again in direct imagistic terms. Let me ask you a question. Who in this audience, and please be bold, have what could be described as a visual education? Who has been to art school? Who has been to photographic or graphic school? Who has been to architectural college? Put your hands up very high. Not very many of you. That means the rest of you are visually illiterate. Just think about that. You never fell out of the womb talking, and you certainly didn't fall out of the womb writing. You had to learn that process, initially presumably from your parents, certainly learning how to talk. Copying, 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 imitating, mimicry. Till by the time you were 5, you could probably hold a decent conversation, at least with your mother. You then go to school and you start learning the alphabet, you put the words together, and throughout all the adolescence, you're adding up your vocabulary, and even as an adult, you never finish polishing your ability to communicate. Particularly complicated here, I am speaking to you in English, and I presume most of you, although I've learned now, of course, something slightly different, most of you speak Finnish, but an awful lot of you also speak several other Scandinavian languages, isn't that true? So across all the language barriers, we're all incredibly clever and very, very sophisticated in handling communication through text, whether it's spoken or written. But who spends as much time, as much energy, as much intelligence, if you like, with the same processes about seeing and looking? Rembrandt famously said, just because you've got eyes doesn't mean to say that you can see. You have to be trained to see. Derrida famously said, lots of famous men, I'm going to keep quoting at you, the image always has the last word. That's very witty in English. I suspect it's also very witty in Finnish as well. The image always has the last word. So, I beg your pardon? We'll talk about music on another occasion. That's a good question after you've seen some of the images that I would like to show you. So there is this feeling then, so if you lose any real excitement, intelligence, desire to express yourself in imagistic terms, and you're losing this age 10, and you're going to die age 80, you spend 70 years without this extraordinary richness. If I were to be made cultural minister for Great Britain, which is extremely unlikely, I would try very, very hard to introduce the notion, indeed, of visual literacy as being very, very important indeed, not simply to enrich, but also to increase the sophistication of the possibilities in the digital age of the notion of visual literacy. I used to think that maybe the cinema would be absolutely the ideal place to be able to expostulate this notion, to make a demonstration, that indeed visual literacy was important. It's actually based on something even older. Vitruvius, the Roman theorist, architecture, suggested that the best education for an educated person, and he's talking about 60 AD, of course, basically in Rome, was to be trained as an architect. Because an architect has to know everything about posterity, history, materials, money, finance, etc., etc. Huge amount of information to make him a really well-educated man. I'm sorry, there weren't very many female architects in AD 60 in Rome. In order to make, I suppose, the notion of an ideal citizen, which I'm sure we're all interested in. It also has to be said, if I'm completely honest, that Vitruvius said it might make an extremely good education for a man, but it was deeply, deeply disturbing for an architect. Because knowing so much, in a sense, a peculiar downside was it froze you. It made you enable, in a sense, to be able to use all that amazing amounts of interconnected information to be able to be used in practice. I remember again, if I can turn this into a personal anecdote, I went to art school in London, we're talking about the late 1960s, with enormous joy and excitement because I desperately wanted to be a painter. I think I enjoyed myself for the first 6 months, then I became gloomier and gloomier and gloomier. Getting all this information together, it made you somehow curiously lacking in confidence. I was at art school for 4 years, and when I came out, I never painted, never again for 5 years. There was a way that so much knowledge, and in a curious way, so much textual knowledge, froze you in a curious way. It's all right. I'm painting again now, but that's more than 5 years ago. I think then that I would have imagined what Vitruvius had said for architecture could very well be said about the possibilities of being a filmmaker, or indeed involved in cinema in some particular way, would also be an incredible, incredible education for visual and textual communication. But I think all of you, and I suspect all of you, if you're not great cineasts who go to the cinema, will realize, of course, those dreams have not come true. We have a text-based cinema. We have a cinema which is basically an illustration of Jane Austen, writ large, over and over and over again, which means we have a cinema really of conductors and not composers. And most film directors are hired hands, of course, fulfilling somebody else's dreams at somebody else's expense. That seems to me to be tragic. Text has so many ways in which to maneuver its information. Think of the theater, which hands down its meaning in text. Think of the novel. Think of narrative poetry. Think of heroic poetry. Think of lyrical poetry. But there's a way, why couldn't we have created a cinema which was essentially about the image, the image, the image? Well, it hasn't happened. Godard, who famously you know is not a French film director, but a Swiss film director, said, okay, let's all play this stupid game. Since most producers are visually illiterate, let's write those goddamn scripts. I pause a moment here. Are there any script writers in the audience? If there were, I would suggest that you should be outside and shot. Cinema is not about literature. If you want to write stories, go and be a novelist. Don't get in the way of cinema. Different practice altogether. Okay, that's my insult for you over today. There are lots of other people I'm going to... Are there any actors in the audience? I really hate actors. Yes? Any more? I always think an actor or an actress who's somebody who's been trained to pretend they're not being watched. That's all you are. Sorry, you're somebody who's been trained. You have been trained, I presume, have you? Yeah. Would you agree with my definition? The efficacy of your success is related to the phrase and the definition that you are somebody who's been trained to pretend that you're not being watched. Isn't that what you do on the screen or on the stage? Okay, more insults coming in your direction in a minute. Umberto Eco, who's a great supporter of the digital revolution and realizes how imagistic it is, how picture-forming it is, said that we've had 8,000 years of the text masters. They've done everything. They've created all our holy books. They've created all our manuals of behavior, how to build a United States aircraft carrier, how to tie a baby's nappy. They have created all our books of morals and ethics. But now, surely, after 8,000 years of prioritizing the text, with the help of the digital revolution, these people should now move aside and allow the image masters, not the text masters, but the image masters, to come forward and educate the world's popular notions of itself by reconfounding this idea of basing, not of course throwing text away completely, but changing the emphasis. I'm not so sure that maybe that's going to happen. The other corollary, he said, was, of course, that now for the first time, it'll be females who make up 51% of the world's population to be able to become really integrated into the new forms of education. It's going to be a slow, slow, slow process, isn't it? But wouldn't you imagine a healthy future for your children, which was much about the communication through the notion of the image as communication through the idea of text? Okay, those are my introductory remarks, giving you a taste of what's to come. What is to come, I hope, getting back, I suppose, to consider those ideas, but also to be closer to the subject of these series of lectures, is this whole notion, indeed, of order and structure and containment, and what does seeing and looking really about, and how do we organize it, and how do we purvey it? I've gone on record repeatedly and boringly ad nauseam about the death of the cinema. I certainly hold on to that, but you know, when I do say that, there is a slight smile on my face. I believe, and it is, of course, part of the nature of art to be provocative. I think that's one of the responsibilities of all artists. There's this phrase, certainly in English, and I'm sure it's true also in Finnish, that if I cannot convince you that a thing is broken, you will make no attempt to mend it. I think also that really Bazin, famous Belgian-French apologist of the cinema in the early 1930s, said that cinema is a combination of literature, the theater, and if you're lucky, painting. Precious little painting, really, in cinema. And I think probably that definition hasn't changed, has it? So let me repeat again. I think most of what we consider to be cinema, when you think about it, is illustrated text, or in some form recorded theater. And again, if you're very lucky, some nod or acknowledgement, slight genuflection towards the history of 8,000 years of painting. And I believe we have to change that if we really, really do want a sophisticated cinema. And I don't think we've got it now. I'll give you a date of the death of cinema. It's the 31st of September, 1983, when the zapper, or the remote control, was introduced into the living rooms of the world. You could sit in your armchair and flick that knob, and it wasn't very sophisticated in 1983, of course, but you could put the television on, you could put the television off, and maybe, for those richer bourgeois amongst us, you could actually maybe change the channel. Now think what you can do from a distance. There's a way you can do multiple things with your television. You can virtually re-edit Kubrick's 2001, sitting in your armchair. All the software is there. In a curious way, we've all become, I suppose, manipulators of cinema. Let me ask you another question. I bet you everybody in this audience is a recipient of the new Trinity. You know, God the Father? I can say this because you're not a Catholic audience, are you? God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Ghost. God the Father is now the mobile phone, His Son is the laptop, and the Holy Spirit, of course, is the camera recorder, the acting phenomenon. And just as the original Trinity empowered the imaginations and offered you in a curious way pie in the sky when you die, the new technological trilogy, of course, does exactly the same, but probably far more efficiently. It empowers you in ways that you have never been empowered before. And of course, it all means you're now filmmakers. You have all the apparatus to make films. So that means the elitisms of Hollywood, Bollywood, and even central, I suppose, Frenchified European cinema are really elites which are disappearing. They're disappearing very rapidly. And I suppose YouTube has certainly helped it on its way. I can communicate with audiences now directly without going through all those extraordinary middlemen who've been parasitic on the body cinema for far, far, far too long. But there are downsides, of course, and I think the downsides to that add to this notion of the death of cinema. We can argue simply, very simply, that certainly since the Beatles' 1963 Magical Mystery Tour, cinemas have been closing all over the world. I live in Amsterdam, and the youth, should we call them, the laptop generation in Amsterdam simply don't go to the cinema anymore. They hardly ever watch broadcast television. And I rather suspect that those characteristics are happening all over Europe, and certainly happening in this country. But there is a hole which is completely filled, which is all this notion again of that Zappa in 1983. It empowers you in a way that cinema has never been empowered before, because you're all now proto-filmmakers. So cinema in a curious way has become active. There's a way, well, let's consider what is supposedly cinema. What are the conditions of cinema? In a minute, I was going to boldly say you're going to be sitting in the dark, but there's an awful lot of light coming in here, so you're not going to be completely sitting in the dark, but you can understand the notion that cinema works best heretofore in the darkest dark that you can find. It's not absolutely true now. I was in Milan a couple of days ago and saw these big screens on the lawn outside Santa Maria del Grazia. It was noonday and a bright Italian sun. And these screens were so extraordinarily brilliant. They were absolutely fully visible in amazing quality. Indeed, in the middle of the day, leave alone the middle of the night. So maybe the requirement for dark is not going to be part of the situation. But if I could easily say that 10 years ago and add it with a rider, what on earth are you as a cinema audience doing in the dark? Because you are not nocturnal animals. So artificial situation number one. This, I suppose, is not really a cinema, is there? We're missing the characteristic, but I suppose if it was a concert hall, that could also be part of the phenomenon. There are no rake seats here. But for the most part, if you were indeed, as you are now, looking at this parallelogram with 4 right angles, your concentration then is always looking forward. Godard famously said that if you are doing that indeed, that 2/3 of the world are behind your head. So 270s of your possible experience are null and void for you. Very, very strange phenomenon. And when you look at me, and certainly when I look at you, you don't see me in a frame, and I certainly don't see you in a frame. Far more complicated than that. And I suspect all of you, have got a gyroscopic head. So the notion of my head, and indeed my eyes, are never ever still. So the possibility of seeing a frame is an entirely man-made artificial situation. Do you remember those films? Are some of you old enough to remember those films in the 1950s, I think, in Czechoslovakia, where they filmed a driver driving a car, his eyes, and it was extraordinary how those eyes never stopped. It was impossible those eyes ever focused for more than a nanosecond on any given phenomenon. I think the only time the eyes absolutely are fixed into immobility is when you are dead. So we've created this notion, along with many other strange ways of creating cinema, on this concept then of the notion of the frame. So let me come back again. You're sitting in the dark. You're looking at one parallelogram of light. And also, if you're watching a feature film, which nowadays is about 120 minutes long, you're all obliged, basically, aren't you, to sit still. I bet you in your beds last night, even when you were fully comatose or half comatose or merely drowsing, your body was on the move all the time. So what have we got? A situation where you're sitting in the dark, looking in one direction, most of the world's behind your head, and absolutely negating your body. Isn't that curious? And we've been doing it, again, if you believe, cinema began in 1895 for 119 years. All that's changing now, of course. And the cinema habits, I think, are all piling up to say that probably my grandchildren will be saying, cinema, what was that? Cinema is going to disappear very, very quickly. Or let's put it another way. Though we're seeing the end of the death of the cinema, we're right in the middle, or maybe the forepart of the middle, of the age of the screen. I'm sure there must be cameras in this room already looking at me and certainly looking at you. Well, there's one there looking at me and one there, but that's very self-conscious. But you know how you are all the time when you go to the supermarket or the church or the nursery, you're on camera somewhere. So much so, you must surely believe if I'm not on camera, I don't exist. So we are right in the middle of the age of the screen. But in a curious way, again, going back to my audience in Amsterdam who don't go to the cinema anymore, of course that screen has moved from the corner of the street in your local neighborhood and have gone indoors. So indeed, although the Dutch, or certainly the Dutch youth, are not going out to watch the screen, as it were, in an outside public venue place, they're certainly watching screens. And that, again, is, I think, in some curious way, that cinema, curiously, isn't this strange, doesn't really recognize, because it still makes films, doesn't it? It still makes films for a big screen and a public audience. The possibility of really realizing that and reorganizing it is another indication where orthodox, I suppose, manufacturing of cinema somehow curiously still hasn't caught up. I think the most valuable people now who are making product, which we will say is about projection of light, are certainly not people in the cinema, but people working in video, people working with websites, people working, in a sense, with all the, what used to be regarded as the accessory activities. And it seems to me very, very important that those people should be encouraged. As you can see, I have far more past than I have future. But I would like very much to align myself with all those people who have this great potential and possibility of using these extraordinary new languages. Microsoft produces one practically every afternoon to re-evaluate, reconsider, re-establish the notions of visual literacy in terms of what used to be called cinema. What I'd like to do then is to consider all the time these sorts of notions, but also I need to entertain you. I sincerely believe in the pleasure principle. I can be academic if you want to be, but that doesn't please me very much. And I am a practicing filmmaker. So I'm not an academic, though I do enjoy being polemical, and I do enjoy academia. But I think that I have to put the product where I have my complaints. So if I say cinema is dying, it's absolutely important for me to say, what are we going to replace it with? How are we going to organize that? I have some 60 hours worth of material on these computers, something probably we've done in the last 5 years, and it's full of experimentation of this and that, and time and place and location, and audience attitude and screen appreciation, etc., which is part indeed of a general push that's now happening in the, for me, most serious end of cinema practice. There's not going to be an awful lot of time to be able to obviously show you 60 hours worth of material. I've only been given 2 hours. One of my American heroes is Buckminster Fuller, who could entertain an audience without boring them for 8 hours. You're not going to be 8 hours, and heaven forbid that I should stand here. But it is very useful for me to be able to take things, as it were, step by step by step. Let's talk about structure, let's talk about chaos. Science now says there is no such thing as chaos. There are laws and scientific inquiry about the unchaotic notion of chaos. But having said that, of course, that's a bit sort of semantic on one particular level. It's not necessarily relative to us groundlings on the floor here, and smacks far too much of extravagant physics. But there is a way that I'm conscious that cinema is full of numbers. Godard said cinema is the truth, 24 frames a second. We talk about 35 mil, 16 mil. We talk about all sorts of new ways of, as it were, acknowledging the mechanics, the technological nature of cinema. And as we move closer and closer and closer into the whole business of television tape, and we've now abandoned Mr. Tarantino. Mr. Tarantino also agrees now, finally. He made a statement at the last Cannes Film Festival that cinema is dead. I think he said it for all the wrong reasons, stupid man. But nonetheless, Godard says it in 1895. I start saying it in 1990, and now Mr. Tarantino in 2014 now agrees with us. Johnny come lately, I think. The need, I think, then, and you must surely agree with this, even if you don't want to apply it to cinema, that it's absolutely important to keep reinventing. If you stand still, you rapidly get left behind. So it's all indicative, I think, as filmmakers, film viewers, film critics, film theoreticians, to be almost aware of all these extraordinary new languages and what they mean. And let me repeat McLuhan again. The medium is the message. I don't think making celluloid films and all that entails is the same now as making films for the present or indeed the near future. There are so many different characteristics, immediacy, spontaneity, ideas of time, which are edging their way into our consciousness. Let me tell you what I really want to make. It sounds extremely pompous and very, very difficult to explain it, but I want to make present tense cinema without narrative on multiple screens. Now, you've had a touch of all those things already. Maybe not narrative is a problem, but certainly there are now multiple screen presentations of all sorts. Just go to Times Square. There are 126 screens in Times Square, not all necessarily keyed into showing you the same thing, but imagine if they would, what an extraordinary experience that would be. And there is something very, very boring about Casablanca, isn't there? Or even Spider-Man, or even Star Wars, that every time you see it, it's the same. I can make you a film now on a Monday, and I can recut it and remake it for you on a Tuesday, on a Wednesday, on a Thursday, on a Friday. Terrifying for cinema managers. Oh, what is that? Is that film 449/B3, etc., etc., etc.? They're going to be chaos, but they're going to have to come to terms with that. There is a way distributors and managers are always light years behind the cutting work edge of what cinema stands for. But we're all used to television, surely, which is basically a present tense medium. Look how fast it moves. But cinema really is a past tense medium. It's already fixed. It's unalterable. But that is not because it cannot be, because our maneuverability now with tape, notions of projection have become extremely sophisticated. And certainly since I've said you don't see me in a frame and I don't see you in a frame and our heads are all gyroscopic and the world is 360 degrees, we ought to be representing that. It'll be some time, because I think you would have to agree with me, wouldn't you, that cinema really is an incredibly moribund, slowly moving, retroactive medium. Here's another provocation. Scorsese really makes the same films as Griffiths, doesn't he? What's the difference? Okay, the emulsion is shinier, the publicity is much bigger, but the notion of grammar, syntax, vocabulary is exactly the same. And if you think again, I keep mentioning this date to make sure you understand how significant it is, 1895, beginnings of cinema, Lumiere and Méliès. There is a way that H.G. Wells is alive, wrote War of the Worlds, I think, in 1895, and now we're post-Perec, we're post-Borges, we're post-Calvino. Van Gogh's still alive in 1895, painting the sunflowers, and now we're post-Andy Warhol, we're post-Lichtenstein, we're post all those extraordinary painters that made the 20th century so fascinating. Strauss is alive in 1895, and now we're post-Stockhausen, post-Boulez, well, you name it. Who's your favorite composer? Steve Reich, Phil Glass would be mine. Look at the long distance between these people who were practicing these arts in 1895 and practicing them now. Can you actually find anything that's cinema that's remotely equivalent to it? I'm sure you can't. Even underground cinema, which of course we know to be very fertile, though isn't it strange that underground cinema hardly ever becomes overground cinema? Picasso was an underground painter once upon a time, and he's certainly an overground painter now. So the ability to encompass what is happening, shall we say, in the fertile undergrowth has very, very little somehow, unless it's transferred almost, morphed almost out of all understanding. I mean, they say Coppola, for example, is a reworking of Godard. Tell me that again. Tell me that again. Very, very difficult to find that to be the truth, though I suppose the notions, again, it has to be of some significance, considering what was happening in the 50s and 60s, both in France and certainly in America. So what am I saying? Let me repeat again, is I do think that we have to keep reinventing, and that has to be a theoretical approach as well as a practical one. I keep trying to drag myself back to the subject. Okay, the notion then is to make, I think, a very self-conscious understanding of what the new media is all about. Take those three phenomena again: non-narrative, constantly present tense, and multiple screen. And let me show you something which I suppose is extraordinarily relevant on a content level to the idea of chaos and structure. Have a look at this. Be patient. The effect is very, very cumulative.
position, 50 miles at 10,000 feet.
Today's fighting men must be taught survival on an atomic battlefield. Quickly, the men are ordered to leave their positions. The explosion's radioactive fallout is almost as dangerous as the blast itself.
encompassed a greater variety of military effect studies than any previous nuclear test series.
So, self-evidently, chaos and structure, but fulfilled with all sorts of ironies. Inevitably, of course, the atomic cloud and all it stands for could be an expression of extraordinary chaos. And we have deliberately made as full a record as we could of all the over 2,000 atomic bombs, and isn't this absolutely shocking and amazing? Over 2,000 atomic bombs have been dropped on the planet Earth. We have tried to locate every single one, so you have film of every single explosion, taken from Russian archives, Chinese archives, American archives, British archives, Israeli archives, and probably several other places. We have made a demonstration in a very archival way of showing you when and where and how explosive and who is responsible. But also, in a sense, we have tabulated everything in a way which is almost self-reflexively structural. So much so that I suppose our attempts at editing have become quite ironic. We have aestheticized the notion of the chaos. So I think in a curious way that this is a very good exemplum of what's made by some notions, indeed, of chaos versus structure, structure versus chaos. There is a uranium festival, which again, of course, is against nuclear fission, which was originated in Rio de Janeiro about 5 years ago, and indeed has a large collection, basically, of anti-nuclear films, and they travel around the world, and I think the next exposition of them will be in Berlin, and they're using this film, which was made about 3 years ago, as their sort of flagship film. Let me move on to something else, which is relative, I would like to think, to everything that we've been saying. Again, it's a series, I suppose, it's a film, which is related to notions of structure. I've always been concerned that when you go to a theater, or indeed when you go to an opera house, what you put on the stage, in a curious way, reflects or relates to that particular space. But my suggestion is whatever you put on a screen, it hardly does anything at all to that screen. And why have we ended up, this is a rhetorical question because I know the answer and you do, but why have we ended up with this particular configuration? Look, you're all seated in a particular configuration, you're all looking in one direction, and there's a way that you are seated, you're not even standing, and of course there are some cinemas you could go and stand in, but they're not very frequent, and the cinema and the screen is at right angles to you. Incidentally, there's only one good seat in this cinema, and he's sitting in it. It's G12, or approximately G12. It's from where the pictures were taken by the cameraman. So the rest of you ought to leave the auditorium. You're all in bad seats. This isn't true about the theater, of course, and it's not true about the opera, because theater and opera basically are three-dimensional experience. So the gentleman way over there and the lady well over there in an opera house or a theater, perfectly valid seats. So you can see something different from what this gentleman in G12 says. And in fact, in an opera house, and you know German and Italian opera houses are built certainly in the 19th century and still are in some places on a horseshoe plan. So basically the audience went to see the audience, to hell what's going on the stage. It's also a very interesting thing, isn't it? The opera houses now turn their lights down in the auditorium. This didn't happen before 1895. The opera houses and the theaters, to a certain extent, have copied the cinema. So if people do go to the opera, again, anybody of you go into the opera? You still go to the opera. Good, good. I think opera is the most stupid, ridiculous art form we've ever invented, but I love it. And I constantly make it. And we've made some extremely expensive operas. It's rather curious, isn't it? I can make a very bad film, and it'll probably be seen in 3 years by 25 million people. But when I go and make an opera in the Opera House in Amsterdam, there are only, I think, 1,800 seats. Let's say there are 2,000. There are probably a maximum of 5 performances, so only 10,000 people can see it. But the opera we did, I think, 10 years ago, it was called Rosa. Music was by Louis Andriessen, Dutch avant-garde composer. So at maximum, only 10,000 people saw it. But the film I was making that year, which was called The Cook, the Thief, His Wife, and Her Lover, was seen by 35 million people. And it costs exactly the same amount of money. So it's interesting for those reasons. I mean, the opera is full of extravagances. And of course, it's magnificently able to handle melodrama. Melodrama and the misogynistic victimization of females is surely the absolute characteristic of opera. Just think of all those victimized females that exist in all those operas. Madame Butterfly, La Traviata, Lulu, the list goes on and on and on. I think probably that opera really finished in 1918 as a serious medium for real discussion of ideas. And that's not surprising, is it? Because cinema took over at the end of the First World War. You know, there is a way in the human psyche that we all demand some extraordinary audiovisual experience. The Greeks were extremely good at doing it. They built amphitheaters where they say you could drop a pin in the center of the amphitheater and 4,000 people could hear it. So they understood about acoustics. I'm told the acoustics of this building are supposed to be rather superlative. I don't know. You probably know that better than I do. But then after the Greeks, and of course they had a tremendous influence for over 1,000 years on notions of theater, or the big audio-visual experience, then came the Romans, where Pompey builds the greatest, largest theater in the center of Rome that's ever been. And then after, I suppose, the Romans, with all their savagery of the Colosseum, great audio-visual, horror X-rated experiences, then would come probably with more X-rated experiences, the Roman Catholic Church, with all their ceremony and their religious buildings all over Europe. That lasted again about another 800 years. And then when we got fed up with the religious mysticism of the notions of religious theater, then we developed, of course, the notions of opera, and opera was supreme, at least for 500 years. And I think probably with what? Wozzeck and Lulu maybe was the death knell finally towards the end of the First World War. And then, of course, cinema took over. Now cinema has been going, as I repeatedly say, for 119 years. But even that audio-visual technology is beginning to wear very thin. And of course, we're looking for a new phenomenon. I would like to be associated with that new phenomenon, as you can probably imagine. Let me show you again some foretaste related to that phrase of what the cinema of the future might be. Perhaps one of my best audiences in Italy. I'm English, and supposedly the English are puritanical, rather like you Finns, and we're not supposed to deal in the Baroque. But the Italians, as you well know, fully understand the notions of Baroque excess. My films are full of excess, colors, activity, people, dialogue, occasions, locations, etc., etc., etc. So it goes down very, very well in Palermo and Naples and Rome, and even in the north, Milan and Turin. But it was in Milan I was offered a commission several years ago in association with a design museum, a fascist building that's just outside Milan, to make, as it were, a prologue for an exhibition about Italian design. The original idea was to take it from 1945, end of the Second World War, till now. But ambitiously I said, well, let's just not go for contemporary design, not just Maseratis and Olivettis, but let's make it a big exposition, if you like, about visual literacy for the Italians. Let's take us all the way back to the explosion of Pompeii. So this is a history, if you like, of nearly 2,000 years of Italian design, and that means paintings as well as furniture, etc. But what I was particularly interested in was this notion of the singular screen, how we all watch this artificial frame and have grown to become associated with it. Isn't it interesting that we watch basically all our plastic arts in a frame? Obviously, when painting around about 1350 moved away from architecture, around about, indeed, 1350 in Pisa, there was a way that, this is all rather strange, isn't it? Because in 1350 in Pisa, it's Gothic architecture, and there are very few rectangles in Gothic architecture, much more complicated organic shapes, which again is more related to the way you see me and I see you. But I suppose when painting finally settled down, let's say certainly by the mid-Renaissance, certainly by 1400, the basic format already was the square or indeed the rectangle. And then, of course, the theater, not in this building particularly, but certainly in general, the theater copied the proscenium arch, copied the picture frame, and then, of course, cinema copied the theater, and television copied the cinema, and when you open books and newspapers, again, there's a goddamn frame. So all our visual imagery is contained within a frame, most artificial proposition. When you look at ballet, when you look at opera, indeed, it's always the same. I think that you have to really explode that frame, and not just me who's saying this, but practically everybody's saying it. Walt Disney now, with his sense around 360-degree environments. So we don't just have to put the image on a vertical screen in right-angle relationship to you. We can put it on the floors and the ceilings, etc., etc. IMAX, Omnimax, you've all experienced these phenomena, I'm sure. It's a bit sad, though, isn't it? Why is the devil given all the best tunes? Why can't really serious, important cinema have access to all this? Well, of course, that's what I'm rooting for. But I wanted, again, to make, or to worry, to be anxious about this phenomenon. Why do we indeed not allow the screen to have some effect on what we project on that screen? So I suggested we should do a multi-screen phenomenon. My first screen then is really, this is of course a two-dimensional effort to imagine all this in 3D, is, here it's obviously seen as a quarter of a disc, but it's meant to represent, in a sense, 1/4 of the globe, of the planet. So that, in a sense, and you can see how this is meant to be not a red communist, but an Italian adult, just under 6 foot. So you can imagine how big that screen is. So it's meant to be, its responsibility of that screen is to handle all the wide shots, all the grand sort of phenomenon, the panorama phenomenon. That again is the principle, but of course I want to be able to use it for other things too. Then the Italians. Any Italians in the audience? Yes. The Italians are responsible, aren't they, for the triumphal arch? A triumphalist people, yes? Look at their army, look at Mussolini, etc. Look at the Roman emperors, look at Caesar. Look at the Grand Forum in Rome. So, in a sense, all our triumphal arch subject matter, and you must judge what that could be, ends up on that screen. And since I'm very interested indeed in the notions of structure, which is so often based upon the grid, which is related on our verticality on the world and our horizontality, there was, wrong computer. I wanted to have an extremely long horizon. You know, the best horizon in the world is, of course, the horizon of the sea. And so this represents far more excess than anything you'd ever seen on CinemaScope. So in a sense, here's a banal notion, that if you want to frame a snake traveling across the ground, isn't it sensible to organize the shape of the framing related to the anatomy of a snake? And indeed, if you wanted to make a giraffe, then doesn't it make some curious sort of sense to have a image, a screen that would somehow be sympathetic to a giraffe's long neck? This shape, you can see, is slightly trapezium, but that's meant to indicate the screen, in fact, is torqued. So I want to continually remind you that there's no necessity to project on a flat surface. We now have all the technology to be able to project on virtually anything. And then, because I always have an awful lot to say, I've given myself 3 footnote screens. So we have 7 screens here. Now imagine this being the possibility of cinema of the future. Remember that definition? Present tense cinema, multiple screens, and also environmental, a 3-dimensional activity. The hall outside the Design Museum in Milan was indeed big enough for this. And sometimes you could have, and look at the people, they're not sitting down. That means you can ambulate, you can walk about, you can leave. And also, I should also tell you, a lot of these screens are not absolutely opaque. Some of them are transparent, some of them are semi-transparent, and the push of a computer button, I can change that transparency. So in fact, you can see screens beyond screens beyond screens. And of course, you can walk around the back. Bit difficult if I want to project lettering, of course, because everything will be backwards if you go around the back. But you'll see by what I'm going to show you in a minute, the enormous efficacy. In a way, it's a bit like Times Square in New York, isn't it? Multiple screens, all different sizes. But what I've done here is to try to compose and organize the imagery for each screen relative to its size, its shape, and certainly to its aspect ratio. So to repeat, here is approximately 2,000 years of Italian art represented on 7 screens. And of course, the soundtrack should be very noisy indeed. With my friend here, who's basically an audio man, I've just agreed with him. The sound is far more important than the picture. Strange me saying that, isn't it, after I've gone on and on and on about the picture. But when you have a good cinema experience, I'm sure the sound is, should we say, relative to 60% of your experience, and perhaps the picture only 40. Debatable, of course, but I don't know. You still all very keen on silent cinema? Does anybody watch silent cinema anymore? Of course. Why of course? Most people only watch silent cinema at Christmas time with Buster Keaton or Charlie Chaplin. There are academics, of course, who are fascinated to find out what Brisbane looked like in 1901, but I think they're a real minority. But if you think of it in general terms, apart from your aficionados who are still fascinated by that, in a sense, 1895 to 1929, millions and millions and millions of silent feature films were made, but they're hardly ever watched again. As for silent films, so very soon, ladies and gentlemen, for all cinema. Don't worry, what happens after cinema is going to be far more exciting than what's happened before. Take a look at this. I am preparing a science fiction film called The Quadruple Fruit, which ideally should be played on such multiple screens. But of course, I imagine we'll only be able to find one venue to do this, because the size and the expense, etc., is very considerable, as you could imagine, to set something up like that. You can also see that if it's about design, then it makes a lot of sense that we continue to refer you to the human body. The glasses on your nose, and currently on my nose, need to be designed and are always relative in a way to human anatomy. And the seats are all arranged to fit nicely your buttocks, and all your clothing has to be related very intimately indeed to the physicality of the bodies. Let me change the subject matter completely. I have suggested the frame is entirely artificial, but I would argue something which is very, very difficult, and I meet enormous amounts of resistance. The narrative does not exist in nature. There really is no such thing as narrative, and it's a man-made phenomenon made for our comfort zones and our ability and wisdom to communicate. Now, I know a great cri de coeur is going to go up, and, well, Mr. Greenaway, what about this, what about that, what about that? But if you think about it, the artificiality of the narrative, I insist, is a man-made phenomenon. So I'm interested, indeed, of how we deal with narrative, and I'm not alone. There's huge numbers of people now are throwing the narrativity question into the ring and really seriously considering what we ought to do about it, what it's all about. I think probably the most receptive audience for a narrative is a young child. A child who you read a bedtime story. I have 4 children, and I've constantly, of course, pushed the idea of bedtime stories. Of course I have. And there's an ability with the suspension of disbelief and the nonsense of irony of a child that you have a completely enthralled audience. I suppose as you grow older and older, that becomes less and less possible. Wasn't it Mallarmé said that you really ought to read all your novels before you're 21? I think you should see all your feature films before you're 21. Because ever afterwards, the suspension of disbelief becomes increasingly difficult. Isn't it extraordinary? You know, I argue constantly there are really only 2 subject matters. One is sex, and the other is death. And all art forms, paintings, certainly cinema, theatre, certainly cinema, are really all about sex and death, aren't they? Aiming my comment now at this actress here, I'm sure it's in her experience. If she's going to become a serious actress, sooner or later, she's going to have to fuck or die. It's a prerequisite on all our cinemas. Think of the films that you've seen in the last 6 months. Run your mind down the plots, and I bet you there are people fucking and dying all over the place. No surprise, is it? Absolutely no surprise. Eros and Thanatos, the very beginning and the very end, both of which we really have no sentience. I think Salvador Dali reckoned he was present at his conception, but he really must be the only one. It's indicative, isn't it? I don't know very much about any of you. I know most of you are probably Finnish and some of you are Swedish, but I do know 2 things about every single one of you. 2 people fucked to make you, and I'm very sorry, but you're all going to die. Everything else is maneuverable, is adjustable, according to economics, climate, geography, advantages, education. So you can make the best of you can between these 2 points of your very, very beginning and your very, very end. So it's no wonder, really, these situations really, really fascinate us. Whether you are a serial killer or a nun. No nuns in the audience? No. The very act of celibacy is an indication of your complexity in relationship to sex, surely. Balzac, the French novelist, suggested money was another subject matter. But so many stupid people have got money, I can't believe it's very important. And after all, we haven't had it very long, have we? Western civilization, 1,000 years and a bit, maybe. And then if you read the plays of Shakespeare, and there are 35 of them, all his plays really are about power. But don't you think both power and money are only means in which we can negotiate the bigger problems of sex and death? So it's no wonder, indeed, is it, that these are prime subject matters. Okay, I had to get that in, but I can't remember how it was related to what I was saying. Oh, narrativity. The stories, the unbelievable stories. So thinking about this idea of this amazing audience that young children are, how can we recapitulate that? Why is it so necessary to dramatize our stories? Why do we have to enact them? Why do we have to find the notion of making a presentation which is essentially theatrical? Why can't we go back, in a way, to be able to tell adult stories? Well, of course, it happens. Telling stories on BBC Radio is fantastically popular. Normally happens very late at night when you're tired and sort of want to fall asleep anyway, which maybe is indicative of how serious we consider this. But what I wanted to do to see of what minimal activity in association with pictorial or imagistic suggestion we could add to the notion of telling stories. And here is another Italian project. It happened in the city of Lucca, which is in northern Italy, quite close to Pisa. And again, historians in the audience probably know about that part of the world, that in the middle and late medieval period, there was this great activity of antagonism between the papacy and the German Empire. Notions of what's called the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. And there are many, many cities in northern Italy, which I'm sure you know, who built towers, forever building towers. The towers didn't really make much sense architecturally. They weren't very useful defensively. So they were very much images of, here's the word, hubris, pride, arrogance. I can build a tower bigger than you can, basically it was all about. And you probably know, you're Dante scholars, Dante got involved in all this. I never remember whether he was a Guelph or a Ghibelline, but he eventually had to leave Florence and ended up in exile. So I was fascinated then by the stories about towers and the idea of towers as an emblematic image, if you like, okay, let's be really vulgar, of sort of phallic supremacy, which were constantly being built in places like Bologna, in places like Padua, and certainly in this place, Lucca. By about the year 1500, most of these towers had either collapsed or had been forced to be taken down. You'll still find a lot of them. What's the name of that famous town near Florence? For me, an unpronounceable name. Yeah, you've got it, yes. Louder? You all know that. You've probably been there. I think that's the town that's got the most towers left. So against this background, but also remembering we have New York and we have thousands of cities all over the world who've started doing it all over again. New York is a city of towers. And of course, New York got really smashed in the face recently, didn't it? By its extraordinary phallic money towers were actually destroyed. So in a sense, the symbolism of the tower still is very, very significant. All right, so combine this idea of this fascination of towers, a delightful city Lucca is. It's completely surrounded by a wall, one of the few fully walled towns left in Italy, but also remember this notion of the idea of the simple story told simply. This film is quite long, so I won't show you all of it, but it consists of 14 stories, which are original, written by me, but what story can ever be original? And you'll see echoes of other material from Boccaccio, from Ariosto, indeed from Roman authors even earlier. And we had a commission from the Franciscan convent in Lucca to make a piece of open-air cinema. I always like this idea, as you probably realize, get away from these enclosed spaces and take cinema out into the world. So we projected these images, and you will see the aspect ratio and the shape that's relevant on the facade of the Franciscan church. As I say, I won't show it all because I would like to show you one or two other things, but I'll show you the introduction. Here we go. Dorado said that the ink tower would rise up like a snake to devour the starlings over the Piazza San Martino.
Gesteraldo diceva che la torre dell'inchiostro si sarebbe innalzata come un serpente per divorare gli storni sopra Piazza San Martino.
Of land in the Via della Stufa that was too narrow to build a house. So he built a tower instead. The kitchen was in the basement and the dining room was on the roof, so he had to get used to eating his pasta cold.
Bambi comprò un lotto di terra in Via della Stufa, troppo piccolo per costruirvi una casa. Allora ci costruì una torre. La cucina era nel piano interrato, la sala da pranzo sul tetto. Così dovette abituarsi a mangiare la sua pasta fredda.
Contessa Veracci bricked herself up in her brother's black tower for fear of her love for him.
La contessa Verracchi si murò nella torre nera del fratello per paura dell'amore che provava per lui.
Okay, there are 14 of those stories, but you can understand what's going on there. A minimal amount of picture adjustment, but I hope used wittily, in a way that doesn't have to dramatize the story, but gives you all sorts of visual cues for you to walk on. All right, I'd like to show you something completely different now. I have said repeatedly that I began my career as a painter, and I've often felt that painting is far more superior than cinema. Painting, certainly in Western Europe, has been going for at least 8,000 years. And I'm envious about notions of what I would call the time frame. You can go to the Louvre in Paris and you can look at the Mona Lisa for 3 seconds. If you're really excited and you can see past the Japanese photographers, you can look at it for 3 minutes. If you're really excited, you can take it and go and look at it for 3 hours. You can actually go back every day for 3 days. You could even be there 3 weeks. This might sound excessive, but Van Gogh sat in front of Rembrandt's The Night Watch in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam for 4 weeks, they say. He brought in his thermos flask of coffee and his sandwiches, and he stayed there and stayed there and stayed there. He was so deeply, deeply fascinated and overcome by the extraordinary phenomenon that that particular painting by Rembrandt represented. But you can see what I'm trying to say. The time frame is the viewers. You decide how long and what sort of sensations and how you want to view it and how it can become part in the sense of your psyche. If I make a film, and I have cause to show you a pair of glasses in some part of the film, I have the time frame, you've completely lost it. I will only show you these glasses from the position I choose and for as long as I choose, so you've lost it. When I want a big ambition and I don't know how to solve it, I often think the DVD was made especially for me because there is a way you can use the DVD like a small cinema at home and simply play the escapist game of playing the whole thing, letting it run over you. But, and it's curious, isn't it, although the facility is there, very few people comparatively use it, there are devices and mechanics for you to interfere, to blow up, to run fast, run smooth, and all those sorts of things. I'm really very fascinated about how those things can be maneuvered. But there is an act, isn't there, with your time frame and painting, that the painting can really, in a curious way, become yours. And I've always envied that, and I'm constantly trying to find ways and means to hold a dialogue with painting. And what we did, Rembrandt, I live in Amsterdam, and I look out my studio window, I look straight into the Rijksmuseum. I have a card in my pocket, I can even show it to you. I have special permission to go to the Rijksmuseum. Here it is, look, Rijksmuseum. It's my name on the back. It means I can visit the paintings of the Rijksmuseum anytime, day or night. I've got to know the janitor at night, so 1 o'clock in the morning I can't sleep. Bang on the door, let me in. I want to see the Vermeers, please. And provided I behave politely, and maybe, buy him an ice cream at the end or something, I can do that. And there's a reason for that, because in the year 2006, which represented the 400th birthday of Rembrandt, he's born in 1606, the Dutch celebrated this great, great, great painter. I don't know whether any of you have actually seen this extraordinary painting called The Night Watch in the Rijksmuseum. It's an extraordinary painting which maybe has become very banal because we see it on postcards and Christmas cards and tea towels and you name it. But when you get to grips with it, it really is extraordinary. And we prepared a special, as it were, event to celebrate Rembrandt's birthday in the summer of 2006. And I said, all right, I'm very happy to do this, and people in Holland know that I'm fascinated by chiaroscuro, about shadows, about lightness and darkness, which really are, of course, the major characteristics of cinema. And it's well known, of course, that Rembrandt, too, deeply, deeply fascinated. It was terribly arrogant to put my name up against Rembrandt, but anyway, for reasons of art criticism, let's continue. And they said, all right, we will give you the Night Watch to play with. Well, now, the Night Watch is uninsurable. It's worth millions and millions and millions. With the Marshall Plan after the Second World War, when the Americans bailed out Holland after it had been virtually economically destroyed by the Nazis, the amount of interest on the loan from America could not be paid. So I think, war ends in 45, even by the year 51, the Dutch still hadn't paid the interest off. And everybody was very embarrassed about this. And the incumbent president said, okay, we will forget absolutely all your debt to us if you give us the Night Watch. No way. Absolutely no way at all. There is a Dutch word. Dutch people in the audience? No? Okay, I'm going to pronounce the word very badly. I don't want to embarrass you. Gezellig, which is the Dutch desire to be together. It's badly translated, and I hate this word, into coziness in English, which sounds very wet to me. I like the idea of calling it domestic solidarity. They love to come together, not just to eat and drink, but just to simply to be together. And if you look at Rembrandt, and you look at Vermeer, and you look at Gabriel Metsu, and you look at Van Steen, and you look at Fabricius, they're full of paintings of people around tables, behaving in a very friendly way, just happy to be within one another's company. And of course, I suppose, in a way, the greatest subject for table paintings would be The Last Supper, and there are millions and millions and millions of those. We're planning now an exhibition in the Brera in Moran simply called Table Paintings, and I've got my eye on several Caravaggios, Supper at Emmaus, for example, numerous Rembrandts about the marriage of Cana. Well, you can think of all the famous supper table paintings in order to bring this concept together so we can structure it and put all these extraordinary works together. But anyway, the classic painting then is painting of Gezellig. So you can imagine how vociferous the Dutch were, saying, no, you're not going to touch this. This really represents us at our best. Maybe also at our worst, maybe at our most claustrophobic, but it's very, very important. Of course, it didn't happen. But then the newspapers in Holland got to know that Greenaway was going to play with a Night Watch. Horror, horror, horror. A foreigner is allowed to play with our choice, amazing item. What did we do? Well, it sounds rather strange, and I have to show you the film to really explain it, but I wanted to hold a dialogue between, if you like, painting and cinema. So with modern computer technology, we photographed the painting centimeter by centimeter by centimeter and stitched it all together on a computer, but it meant that I could mask everything. A very simple idea that I could cut out, in fact, all the painting. Let me put it up on the screen so we know what we're talking about here. I can I can get rid of everything apart from the highlight in his eye, or apart from that bead in this young lady's necklace, or apart from that high shine on this gentleman's helmet. So, in a sense, I then had control over every single part of the painting, and I could reconstitute it and play with it. So I could change the color, I could change the shadow, I could change the contrast. And in doing that, I could simulate movement. I could manipulate, in a sense, the color, etc., etc. I could also, but I didn't like doing this, introduce extraneous items. I wanted to remain pure and only dealt with what Rembrandt dealt. Well, at that time, Holland was full of Rembrandt fervor. You know, there were hundreds of exhibitions about Rembrandt. There were lots of exhibitions about Rembrandt's mother. There were even exhibitions about Rembrandt's dogs. I'm told, though of course it's very difficult to believe, they say there were even exhibitions about the fleas on the back of Rembrandt's dog. It was obsessive. There were parties everywhere, and apparently Rembrandt's favorite meal, of course being very Dutch, was dry, sour black bread and herring. So there were breakfast parties, everybody eating black bread and sour herrings. It was very successful. We also put up, we didn't change, it's hanging, it's actually, the Rice Museum has just been refurbished, so things have changed. But once upon a time, it hung in a very, very prominent part in that museum. In fact, the Rice Museum, in a sense, was built like a Catholic church, and this painting, just to show how it was revered, was placed exactly where traditionally the altar would be placed. It's very large. It's much bigger than this. It's about twice as big, so it probably contains all this sort of space. And we projected then our photographic image with all this masking on top of it, so that in a sense we could bring cinematic qualities. Now, I'm not going to show you that, but what happened, it was so successful. What we also did is we built an audience of fixed seating in the same room. There are, I think, 36 people in this painting, so we built an audience that only had 36 seats. So in a sense, you could identify with each person. And although you could go, you know, a lady in a blue rinse who came from Arkansas, who didn't want any of this nonsense and just wanted to see the painting, we could certainly stop our projection and she could see it for 10 minutes, back to that time frame thing. But then every 10 minutes, the lights went down and we showed this manifestation. It was so successful, and of course it's a big educational tool. I can show you its structure, its organization, the 3 dimensions versus the 2 dimensions. I can explain, you know, why this man has got this lance, which is really equivalent of his penis. I can explain the homosexual relationship between these 2 men, why this man is overdressed, why this man is black and has a tail that's a bit like Satan's tail. I can explain that because Rembrandt was interested in paintings of Velasquez, this isn't a young woman at all, but in fact is a dwarf. I can explain why there are 13 unlucky pikes. I can explain why this man is pointing at him, who's looking at him, who's looking at him, etc., etc. There's an awful lot in this painting to decipher and interpret in a structural way. But also I can regard it, of course, as a, you know, as a 2-dimensional item. I don't know whether you can see on the flag here, there are 4 crosses, 3 crosses, the 3 crosses of St. Bartholomew, which represent even now, I'm sure you've been to Amsterdam, you know, on all those phallic posts in the red light district, there are 3 crosses on them. People have said, what are those crosses about? And of course, the local people invent all sorts of myths to entertain foreigners. But apparently the best example I like is the 3 crosses represent 3 curses, if you like, on Amsterdam. And in English, they all begin with the letter F. Flood, fire, and the flea. Flood, because most of Amsterdam is built below sea level. My house is 3.5 meters below sea level. Fire, because just like indeed this city, I'm told, was built around about 1642, wood, and was always catching fire. And the third was the flea. Now, they didn't really know about the flea, so this is an afterthought. But Amsterdam's a port, so it's always been attacked by rats, which get off the ships that come from the Far East. And I think Rembrandt lost 2 of his mistresses, 1 of his wives, and 3 of his children with the plague. So it's very significant, because they never understood the mechanism, how the plague is related to the flea on the back of the black rat. But you can see the significance, and we played with that. Anyway, it was very successful, and all sorts of collectors and gallery owners all over Europe came, and the man who was the director of the Santa Maria del Grazia in Milan, where they hold this extraordinary painting, suggested we should come and do it. And I will show you what we did for that painting. But just to explain, this event, making a dialogue between painting and cinema, was so successful that we got a great flurry of people who said, come and do it for us. Come and see this painting. Of course, there are certain requirements here. I had to have a painting which was cinematic. You know, this is even bigger than the painting I've just showed you. And the ruling was that 50 people had to be able to see the painting at one time. So I'm sorry, the Mona Lisa is not going to work. And also, every painting had to be really significant. And as you know, great paintings create an enormous sense of precedent. Painting was never the same again after 1498 when Da Vinci painted this. It was never the same again after Rembrandt had painted, because the impact of the painting was so strong, and painting is like a club. Everybody wants to belong to the same club. You know, Picasso reworks Velázquez, Henry Moore reworks Michelangelo, Francis Bacon reworks Raphael. All the painters all belong to a club saying, I know this, you know this, didn't this, etc., etc. And of course, all painters recognize that. So every single painting we chose had to be really deeply significant. So those are the first 2. This is the one we did last year. It's a painting by Veronese, and it's in the island opposite St. Mark's Square in Venice. This is a famous painting by Velázquez. Up here, they say, is the greatest painting of nothingness in the whole history of European painting, and you can see why. There's nothing there, but isn't it brilliantly painted? It's a bit like, composers being asked, okay, give me 3.5 minutes of silence. Total oxymoron, contradiction, but you understand what's going on. Next year, we are supposed to be tackling this. We're actually going to turn it into an opera. I think this gentleman over here might know the Italian composer Giovanni Solimar is going to write the music for it. And then the following year, we are going to tackle one of Monet's many versions of the Lilies. Then there's this Seurat, which is in Chicago, La Grande Jatte. Then there's this Jackson Pollock, and this is going to require a completely different technique. What I'm fascinated, as you probably know, Jackson Pollock painted this on the floor, so we've asked the directors of MoMA to lay it on the floor like it originally was, and we're going to have our projection in the ceiling. What we have to do, of course, to be very sensible about this and creditable, to satisfy indeed all the art enthusiasts and all the really aficionados who know all about these paintings, is to find a conceit. So certainly the Rembrandt's about chiaroscuro, so it's about the ability to model light and dark. The Da Vinci is very much about solidity, the notion of gravitas, gravity, and weight. Jackson Pollock will be about all sorts of notions about sequence. We're going to strip this painting down, and I think there are about 10 paintings, 10 colors here, obviously black and white, but there's some gray and there's some red. So we will repaint the painting, if you like, filmically, to show a question of process. And I can hardly believe this, but it's apparently true, the new Pope has some cardinals who are deeply fascinated by the idea of the relationship of Julius II, the great Pope, with Michelangelo. He was responsible for commissioning the Sistine Chapel, and they hope, and I think they hope in vain, but nonetheless it's interesting, to try and get artists to come back and support notions of, I suppose, the symbolic value of art in association with contemporary Roman Catholicism. I'm sure it's not going to work. But nonetheless, the Pope invited us all to the Sistine Chapel. I was sitting directly underneath, you know that amazing gesture where God touches the finger? And I don't understand Italian very well, so I was hardly listening to the Pope, and I was always looking up at this extraordinary image above my head. But virtually all the artists, you know, Bill Viola, Libeskind, Geary, architects, painters, composers were all there. There must have been about 300 of us. We were all given a little medal and told a way to think about it. Well, I've thought about it for a long time before we ever got to that meeting in the Sistine Chapel. And I've always been amazed. Could you consider what would have happened if Michelangelo had been given electricity? Now, some of you might think that's an extraordinary, banal thing to just think about. But if you think about St. Peter's, it's the most extraordinary palimpsest of everything, isn't it? You know, it's about color and light and painting and sculpture and architecture and terrazzo and mosaic and choir boys singing and incense and light coming in from the stage. It's a total Wagnerian, total artwork, beautifully made and extremely moving, even if you are an absolute dyed-in-the-wool atheist like I am. I am deeply moved by that place. So it has been agreed that in the year 2018, they are going to give me this painting to play with. Now, I'm not a believer by any means, but it is an extraordinary image, symbolicness of upness and downness, and good and evil, and success and failure. A grand sort of exemplum, if you like, a summation of religious thought of the year, I think it's 1535, I think he painted it. It was painted considerable time after the other famous wall, which of course comes out over here. So that's our plan. But let me show you, after I've been talking about this, about what we actually do. So I'll show you first of all what we did with the Da Vinci, and then show you what, again, we did with the Veronese, which is even more sophisticated, but just give you an idea. Okay, this is interesting for the person who asks questions about music. Have a close look. We have broken down this painting, described, I suppose, its structure based on the number 3. There are 13 people at the table, of course, as there are in all Last Suppers. That's 12 plus 1. That's 4 times 3 plus 1. Leonardo, as you know, was a great mathematician and loved playing with notions of symmetry. We have repeated the story. Watch out for Judas Iscariot receiving the money. If you know the minutiae of the New Testament story, that Saint Peter tries to cut off the ear of the centurion, and the knife is on the table already. Think also that it is said that all the items that are laid on the table form the solar system. Now, how on earth Leonardo da Vinci knew about that when he painted it in 1498 is very difficult to know, but it is said he anticipated the planet Pluto. So one of those bread rolls on the table is actually Pluto. Now, Pluto wasn't discovered until 1912, and he's painting this in 1498. You can see a whole amount of mysticism becomes involved in the painting. The Rembrandt, of course, is exhibited in a very secular country, which is Holland, but of course Italy is still very Roman Catholic, and the painting is an act of, it is an act of religious association. Let me tell you an anecdote. A lot of the Dutch feel, however brilliant Rembrandt was or is, they were also, being sort of money-conscious people, I don't offend the Dutch here, I hope, were always excited by the fact that Rembrandt was a very, very good businessman. It was actually his wife Saskia who did the books. But nonetheless, he was very successful, lived in a very, very expensive house in the north of Amsterdam. So when we went there to prepare ourselves for the projection on the painting, the first night, because I had to stay at night because the public were there during the day, so we would arrive at 6 o'clock when the museum closed. The first night we were there, and I say we because I had all the technicians with me as well. There were, I think there were 4 policemen, 3 art historians, and 2 police dogs. They were sort of worried about, what are these strange people going to do to our famous painting? By the end of the week, all the art historians had gone home. The dogs had long disappeared. I think there were 2 policemen. The following Monday, the director of the gallery gave me the key. So that shows you how, I think, the deeply, deeply pragmatic sort of Dutch feel about their art. Whereas with The Last Supper, it was all genuflection and a great concern again for the religiosity of the painting. Let me show you then what we did to The Last Supper. Here we go. It's long been said that Leonardo supplied the background for a piece of music. You know those hands we isolated? They're all notes on a musical stave, and they are supposed to be the notes. I don't quite understand how this happened. This all sounds a bit apocryphal to me, but if you have faith in these things, that was actually the Song of Solomon played in the first temple in Jerusalem before it was destroyed by the Romans at Masada, and that Beethoven used it to help the one of the symphonies are supposed to be related to those notes. And you can see we've isolated indeed that music, and we gave it to Marco Robino, who is the composer who I'm working with now very closely, and he recomposed it, and the music you hear on the soundtrack is the result of that particular examination. If you can believe anything, well, there you go. An even more extraordinary story, you see how incredibly concerned about perspective the painting is. And if you take the perspective lines of the windows behind Christ's head and you extend them, as it were, out through the back wall of Santa Maria, it's in a refectory, out the back of the refectory, and you take them all the way across Milan and all the way across Italy, you will end up with the position of the Twin Towers in New York. Now, you can believe that if you like. So that, in a curious way, is part of, I suppose, the mysticism of the painting. They're also supposed to predicate, I think, these perspective lines, the Eiffel Tower in Paris, too. All seems rather convenient to me. But it's still an indication, again, of the power of that painting. Let me show you what we did. Last thing I will show you, apart from maybe the Eisenstein phenomenon, is, again, what we did with the marriage of Cana.
We have a little bit lack of schedule now, so...
Okay, because we don't have a lot of time left, let me show you the ending of this film. You might know the marriage of Cana is the story of Christ's first miracle of turning, indeed, the water into wine. So what I did is I gave all 210 people in this painting a voice. I made dialogue for them. Of course, it's a Jewish wedding, so we can play all the games about a Jewish wedding, but of course a very, very particular Jewish wedding, because it's the lead up eventually to the crucifixion. But let me find you the moment where the actual miracle takes place. Please remember, how on earth can we express miracles in the 21st century?
Centre of the feast. Upstaging the bride and groom. How do we get down to the ground floor?
But there are places left to sit. Smelling the food from the kitchens is making me hungry.
And thirsty. I know the doorman on the East Gate. He's married to my cousin and a great drinker.
We could go round by the carriage door and enter through the kitchens.
Who's that? Could be the commissioned painter. You couldn't miss him wearing that white outfit. He's the only one wearing white in the whole company. Trust him to make a spectacular entry. Where did they find him? This miracle worker. Is it some trick of the Iron Throat? How did he do it? Wave a magic hand? Put his fingers into the water? How can such a thing be possible? Did he drop in some pomegranate juice? Some spirit of figs, duck's blood?
Hold it steady. It may very well be miracle stuff, but it will spill over just like any other wine.
There won't be any left. They are enjoying
I can
it
vouch
so
at
much.
last for a miracle in a public place.
If such an event were to be repeated every day, we would soon gather a multitude and a decent treasury.
And, no doubt, draw a great deal of unwelcome attention. We would be accused of showing off, exhibitionism.
A multitude is too small a number. In the end, we will gather the world.
Okay, so much more to show you, but there's some examples of what this brand and extraordinary new digital revolution will be able to do for us for the cinema of the future. Thank you.